Welcome back, everyone, to Furthering Christendom. I'm your co-host, Mike DeVito, here with Dr. Tyler McNabb. And today we have our good friend, Stephen Nemes. Stephen is a PhD candidate in systematic theology at Fuller Theological Seminary under the great Dr. Oliver Crisp. He's written extensively in a number of areas, including phenomenology, Thomism, theology, philosophy of religion. He also has an affinity for continental philosophy. And so in preparation for today, I picked up some study guides to help me prepare as an wannabe analytic philosopher. I got some, pocket translators to get ready for this interview. But no, we have the great Stephen Nemes. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, man. How you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing well. I'm glad to be here.
So Tyler, what are we talking about, brother? How are we doing this, bro? We jumping right into phenomenology, or what are we doing?
Yeah, so Stephen's gonna help me because I'm teaching in this Catholic seminary now, and a lot of Catholic philosophers talk about phenomenology, and I try my best to hang with them and try to understand what's going on, but I'm not there yet. So Stephen is going to teach us. He's going to take us to school, and he's going to tell us what exactly phenomenology is all about. So we can go ahead and start off with that question, Stephen. What's phenomenology?
That's a good question, and it's a question that permits a very simple and straightforward answer, and yet at the same time matters are really complex. So if you wanted to just give an etymological answer, you could say that phenomenology is, the logos of the phenomena. A phenomenon in Greek, phenomenon, is something that shows itself, something that appears. And of course, logos is discourse or reasoning about something. So if you were to just take, the two parts of the word together, you would say that phenomenology is discourse or study of what appears. Robert Sokolowski gives a more perhaps lay-friendly definition. He says that phenomenology is the study of human experience and of the ways in which things disclose themselves to us in and through such experience. So generally speaking, the idea in phenomenology is to pay close attention to conscious experience, and not just sense experience, but any forms of consciousness, as ways in which the world shows itself to us, as ways in which we are witnesses to the disclosure of things. That would be a kind of a basic definition of phenomenology. At the same time, there are different forms of phenomenology. As Husserl moved forward in his career and developed his thought, it underwent many evolutions. And so eventually there, were introduced distinctions between what is called static phenomenology and genetic phenomenology. And then later, towards the end of his career, he started talking about a constitutive or a generative phenomenology. So matters are a little more complicated than just saying that phenomenology is the study of what appears. It turns out that when you try to study what appears, things quickly become quite complicated. We'll perhaps talk about this a little later. But as a beginning, as a sort of an entry into the field, we can say that phenomenology is the study of human experience and of the ways in which things disclose themselves to us through such experience.
Yeah, okay, great. So why should I be interested in phenomenology, especially as like an analytic philosopher? Go ahead and try to maybe make a quick case for why I should be concerned with phenomenology.
Yeah, I think that the essential argument for phenomenology is something like this. When we talk about things, when we talk or when we engage in reasoning, we're always talking or reasoning about something, right? Our reasoning, our discourse always has an object. But it turns out that it's possible for us to take ourselves to be reasoning about one thing when in fact we're reasoning about something else. And I think that this is actually what happens quite often in philosophy. Now, how is this possible? How is it that we can take ourselves to be reasoning about one thing, but in fact we're reasoning about another? Well, in order for us to reason, in order for us to start thinking about something, we have to, take the thing that we're going to reason about as being in some way or other, right? So if I'm going to reason about something, I have to say, okay, well, what is this something that I'm going to reason about? Let's say that it's a chair, or let's say that it's a dog or a cat or a human being or an abstract object or whatever. Okay. So in order for us to reason, we have to intend a target of our reasoning and then take that target as being something or other. We have to give it some kind of content in our mind so that we can start with something and then work from there. But of course, it's possible for us to take something as being, for example, an X when it is not in fact an X, right? So just because I presume to talk about a thing as if it were a chair, it doesn't follow that it actually is a chair. And so, I can talk about God as if, for example, we can talk about God in philosophy of religion. I can talk about God as if he were, basically a disembodied mind, with various mental states and so on. But it doesn't follow that God is actually like that. So that means that my reasoning can be as lucid and as convincing as you want, but I haven't proven anything about my intended target of discourse unless it is, such as I took it to be. So I can talk about God for all I want as a disembodied mind with various mental states and so on. But if God is not actually like that, then I haven't proven anything with my reasoning. I've only proven, what would be the right way to talk about God if he were so, So that shows us that when we want to reason and when we want to discourse about things, if we want our reasoning to have a foundation in reality, we cannot simply begin from certain assumptions. We cannot simply begin from our decision to take the object of our discourse as being such and such. If we really want to have knowledge of a thing, we have to begin, with the thing itself. We cannot begin with our assumptions about what the thing is. We have to begin with the thing. We have to let the thing itself that we want to talk about sort of dictate the course of our reasoning and determine the path that we're going to take in talking about it. But of course, in order for us to let the thing lead the way in our reasoning, then that thing has to show itself to us, right? It has to in some way make itself evident to us, and that can only take place in experience. That can only take place in some form of conscious experience or other, in which the thing gives itself to be known, and which the thing shows itself to be such and such. So that means, of course, that because phenomenology is the study of experience and of the way things disclose themselves to us in experience, phenomenology is necessary if we're going to have a rigorous and properly scientific understanding of things. Phenomenology is necessary because we cannot simply begin with our assumptions about what things are and then reason on the basis of those assumptions. We have to begin with what the thing is in itself. We have to begin with what the thing actually is and not what we say the thing is. And in order to do that, we have to turn to the thing and we have to let the thing that we want to reason about dictate the path that we take in our reasoning. And that means that we have to pay attention to the way the thing discloses itself in experience. So that's a sort of a brief, maybe 2 or 3 minute argument in favor of phenomenology. Basically, the idea is this: our reasoning and our discourse, if it's to be properly founded, has to begin from its intended object. And the only way for us to begin from our intended object of discourse and not simply our assumptions about it is to pay attention to the way that thing shows itself in experience. And phenomenology is precisely paying attention to the way things show themselves in experience. And so that's why phenomenology is not only recommended, but I would say even necessary.
Yeah, that's great, Stephen. This is brand new to me too. So maybe you could take us maybe even a little bit more into the weeds and talk about some of the sort of central ideas or maybe some of the key concepts within phenomenology. Sure.
I think so. Okay, there are disagreements about what constitutes phenomenology. In the early 1990s, there was in fact a major controversy because there were various really influential phenomenological writers, such as Emmanuel Levinas, Jean-Luc Marion, and others, who were using phenomenology to talk about religious topics. There was this one philosopher in France, Dominique Janicot was his name. He didn't like this. He said that Husserlian phenomenology has nothing to do with the topics of religion. It has only to do with, the immanent sphere of experience. So people disagree about what actually phenomenology is about, right? Janicot, for example, thought that Husserlian phenomenology was irrelevant to religion. Jean-Luc Marion, for example, says that actually in Husserl's phenomenology itself, there are like the seeds of an opening, towards religion and towards religious topics of discussion. So all that is to say that what is phenomenology exactly? That's a disputed question. But I will give you what I understand to be some of the basic theoretical commitments of phenomenology. There are three of them. One of them is what I'll call an ontological commitment. The other one is an epistemological commitment. And then the final one is a methodological commitment. So phenomenology has to do with ontology, epistemology, and method. What is the ontological commitment of phenomenology? As I understand it, phenomenology is committed to the view that consciousness is, as I say, the arena of the self-disclosure of being. So just like, for example, Mike, when you were playing football, all the players are in the arena and they're, everything that the players are doing are transparent to the people in the stands. Right. Consciousness, according to phenomenology, in my interpretation, is like an arena in which things show themselves. So this can be helpfully compared to, like what Immanuel Kant, for example, says about consciousness. He says that our experience of the world is basically passed through this filter of these transcendental categories. And so what we see is not so much the world in itself, but the world as it appears to us, given the kind of the mold that our consciousness imprints upon it. So for Kant, there's a distinction between the world as it is in itself and then the world as it appears to us. Phenomenology does away with that distinction. It sort of identifies the two. The world as it is exactly as it appears to us. The world is, like Sokolowski says in his book, Introduction to Phenomenology, nothing in phenomenology is a mere appearance. Appearances belong to being. Things are as they appear. So that's the first commitment of phenomenology, that consciousness is the arena of the self-disclosure of being. There is no distinction between what is and what shows itself. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that everything shows itself in every possible way all at once, right? So for example, to use a familiar example, you see me right now, but you only see the front of me. You don't see the back of me, right? You don't know what's on the back of my shirt. You don't know what's on the bottom part of this bookshelf. You don't know what's behind that wall. So, when it comes to like things that we see in the world, we can only see a part of them at one time. But phenomenologically speaking, it's not as if there's like this hidden kernel somewhere in that object that could not in principle be shown. Everything about that object is visible in principle, even if it's not all visible at once. So, for example, you can see what's on the front of my shirt, you can't see what's on the back, but if I were to turn around, then you could see what's on the back. And in general, for phenomenology, as I interpret it, there is nothing hidden. Everything is, in principle, if not perfectly manifest, then at least manifestable in that respect.
Including
so that's
God.
The first, that's the interesting question. Some phenomenologists, for example, do say, I was supposed to present at a conference this January. It got canceled and postponed until 2022. But the title of the conference was God as Phenomenon. So, there are some phenomenological writers in the phenomenological tradition that say that, God somehow can be apparent, or perhaps he shows himself in certain ways. And when I was at a conference in Valparaiso, Indiana in 2019 in October, there was a question and answer session. And somebody said, very casually in one of the question and answer sessions about something, well, of course, obviously God shows himself, right? Obviously God is, it becomes visible, is a phenomenon. And nobody really challenged this. So my own inclinations are to say that God is not a phenomenon, at least not in a sort of an ordinary way. But that is where sort of I differ from some other phenomenologists. So that is maybe a possible tension in my own thinking that I would have to address, at a later time.
Sure.
I would say this. I would say at least God is visible as that in virtue of which things exist. So I would say there is a way in which God shows himself. He shows himself as, sort of the cause of things, but he doesn't show himself more than that. It's not as if I can and just like John of Damascus or Thomas Aquinas or these other figures in the classical theistic tradition have said, it's not as if I know what God is. I just know that he is, the cause of things. But what he is in himself, what he is in his nature is unknown to me. And that's because I don't have the right stuff, so to speak, to be able to see him. maybe in the resurrection, when we attain to the beatific vision, something will be different about me, and then I can see him. So even then, again, in that case, it's not that God would be in principle invisible. It's just that he would be invisible to me, given the way that I am now. So that would be a sort of a quick discussion of the topic of the visibility of God in phenomenology.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say. So you were talking about the commitments. So I was just going back to the wait before I rudely interrupted you.
No, it's quite all right.
And finished off there.
Yeah. So the ontological commitment of phenomenology can be summarized in this slogan, which I used in my dissertation. Consciousness is the arena of the self-disclosure of being. So being shows itself to us in consciousness, and there's nothing left over. Nothing is hidden in principle. The epistemological commitment of phenomenology has to do with the way in which phenomenologists understand knowledge to work. And it's very important to understand that for phenomenology, knowledge, I think, really can be understood as essentially being a form of seeing. Just like, for example, I see there's a coffee table next to the couch on the opposite side of this phone here, or just like I see that Tyler is wearing glasses. All knowledge in the end is a form of seeing in phenomenology. But it's not as simple as, just like sitting down and looking around a room. Things are a little more complicated than that. I mean, even, for example, even when I see the table that's in front of me, it's not enough simply for me to sit here and to look, because there are a lot of things that are visible in my room that are not, the focus of my attention. I have to, and in a strict sense, I don't see them, even though they're right there in front of me. In order for me to see something, I have to have my mind sort of appropriately focused on it, so that it can show itself. And this sort of focusing of the mind in phenomenology is called constitution. When I walk into a room, if it's the first time that I've ever walked into that room, I might look around the room and see what's in there. And then as I'm looking around, I say, oh, there's a table, there's a couch, there's a bookshelf. Oh, look at that, piano in the corner. What I'm doing is I'm constituting these objects for me. I'm sort of looking around my environment, and I'm, focusing my mind in such a way that I can isolate each item. I can call it something in my mind, and then be able to after I constitute it, I can then think about it. Oh, there's a piano. Oh, and look, it's a really nice piano. Look at the keys. Look at the gold trim along the wood, and so on. So basically, what happens in phenomenology is that seeing is this kind of back and forth between the mind and the world. The world sort of shows itself, but the mind has to first constitute an object, and then form various judgments about what that object is, right? So there are a lot of things, like I said, there are a lot of things in my room right now that are visible, but I don't notice them. There's a particular corner of the carpet in my apartment building that is visible. It's right there for me to see, but I'm not thinking about it, and I don't notice it until I make an effort to sort of constitute it as a particular object of my consciousness, and then to begin to think about it. Now, essentially for phenomenology, knowledge consists in what is called evidence. And it's important to understand that for phenomenology, evidence is not simply like the reasons you might have, for believing something. Evidence is not basically, motivations for accepting a certain proposition or anything like that. Evidence is something that takes place when you see something clearly. So evidence in the phenomenological sense means something like clarity or transparency or something along those lines. And so what does it mean exactly to attain to evidence? Suppose that I'm thinking to myself, okay, where did I put this book? I'm looking for a particular book of mine. Let's say I'm looking for, Warranted Christian Belief by Plantinga, right? I need a coaster to put my coffee cup under, put under my coffee cup. I'm looking for the book.
Heresy.
Right? So suppose I'm profaning a sacred object in Tyler's mind.
Oh, that's great.
Suppose I'm looking for a copy of my Plantinga book because I need a coaster to put my coffee on, and I think to myself, okay, where did I put it? Oh, I know where I put it. I put it, in the bathroom next to the toilet, let's say, right? So let's say that I formed this judgment. I put the copy of Plantinga in the bathroom next to the toilet.
Oh, no.
So I go into the bathroom and I look next to the toilet, and there it is, exactly where I said it was. Now, something special has happened here. Okay, this is a phenomenon of evidence. I form a judgment And then later, the thing that I, formed that judgment about shows itself to be such as I judged it.
Mm.
So I said the book was in the bathroom by the toilet, and then later the book showed itself, precisely to be in the bathroom by the toilet. That is evidence. So that phenomenon where my judgment is fulfilled by something given in experience, that's evidence in phenomenology. And for phenomenology, it's important to note that there are two sort of aspects to this evidence. On the one hand, there's judgment evidence, and on the other hand, there's object evidence. Judgment evidence basically is what happens when I can see that my judgment is true. And so, for example, if I go into the bathroom, I can see that what I said is true because, the object is right there, exactly as I said it was. But in order for me to see that my judgment is true, the thing that my judgment is about has to also be present to me in some way. And more specifically, it has to be present to me in such a way that it shows itself to be exactly as I judged it. So in order for me to see that my judgment is true, I have to be able to see that the object is, such as I judged it to be. So judgment evidence presupposes what we might call object evidence. Basically, for phenomenology, if something does not show itself, if something does not make itself clear to you in consciousness, then you cannot know it.
Mm.
And that's why phenomenologists, for example, reject this notion of a Kantian, hidden thing in itself, because something that cannot be experienced and that cannot show itself to us cannot mean anything to us, right? If it can never become an object of experience, if it can't do anything to us, if we can't become aware of it in some way, why bother talking about it? Why even, suggest that there is such a thing? For phenomenology, experience is the final arbiter of everything that we say. The final arbiter of all of our philosophical claims and all our philosophical notions is experience. Now, that doesn't mean just sense experience, because there are other forms of experience that phenomenology admits, but experience of some kind, consciousness of some kind, is necessary for phenomenology. So judgment evidence to stop our engagement with the world and to reflect on what it is that appears to us. And so if you don't mind, I can sort of try to motivate you. I can try to, guide a meditation into the phenomenological attitude.
Yeah, please do, Stephen. I didn't realize it was this practical. That's really cool. Yeah, I'm all about it.
So let's consider this. Okay, so let's ask the question, what appears? Because that's the phenomenological question. What appears?
Okay.
Now, for a person in the natural attitude, they will say that what appears, they'll just point to something that's in front of them, right? What appears to me is Mike on the screen of my phone. What appears is, the coffee table, the couch, the wall. So typically when you ask a person what appears to you, they're going to point out some object, right, that happens to preoccupy their attention. But if you pay close attention, it's never merely one object that appears to us. It's always a bunch of objects that are in the same space.
Right, right.
And all of these objects contribute to, my experience in different ways. So for example, the couch appears to me just like the floor of my apartment does, but the couch covers parts of the floor. I cannot see what's under the couch, right? So those parts of the floor are hidden to me. Furthermore, the light from the sun is coming inside of my room through the open windows, but I have blinds, and so there are certain patterns of shadows on the wall that I see, and that's because of the light. Now, the light that is coming into the room is a sort of a white light from the sun, right? If they were a different color light, then the things in my room would look different. So when it comes to the objects that are outside of us, all of these things are appearing separately, and then their appearances sort of mix and blend with each other, so that they influence the way that they all appear to me, right? The floor appears to me a certain way because of the lighting that's in this room. If the lighting were different, then it would look different than it does. Now it looks like it has a lot of shadows on it, but if the light were really bright in here, then it would look just, clean or whatever. The couch looks the way that it does because of the light that's on it. If there were blue light in my, apartment or some other color light, then the couch itself would look different. So we can see that the objects that are in our environment, these, objects that occupy the same space, they all appear, but they all, influence the way each other appears. They only appear the way they do because of the particular configuration they're in. So not only do we not just see one object, we see a plurality of objects in the first place, and all these objects influence the way they appear. All these objects, contribute something to the appearance, and this contribution sort of mixes and blends in an interesting way. But beyond that, beyond just objects in a spatial environment, my body also appears to me in certain ways, right? So there's the trivial sense in which my body appears to me as an external object. I just hold my hand in front of my face and I can see it that way. But my body also contributes to experience in a more subtle way. So for example, I don't have my glasses on right now, so that means that things, at the end of the room look blurry to me. Now, for example, the lock on my front door of my apartment, it looks blurry to me. Is that because the lock itself is blurry? No, it's because my eyes are bad, right? And if I were to put my glasses on, then it wouldn't look blurry anymore. So not only do external objects appear to me, but my own body also appears to me. It makes a contribution to appearance because I see those things through my body. And so this contribution, for example, is the blurriness of distant objects, which is the way in which I can become aware of my own eyes. The firmness of this chair is something that I'm aware of, something that shows itself to me through the fact that I'm sitting on it and it resists my body weight and so on. So there's the external objects that all, are appearing at the same time. There's my body, which also, appears and is evident to me as, that through which external bodies become evident to me. But in addition to that, there's also what I call the thought life of a person that is also contributing to experience. I experience these things in a certain way because of the way that I think, my habits of interpretation, my past experiences, my memories, my expectations about, what I can expect to see in this environment. Imagine, for example, if I had, some great-great-grandparents of mine, from, rural pre-communist Romania, in the early 1900s, and they were to see what I'm doing right now. Right? As far as like external objects are concerned, my cell phone and my ring lamp and all that are perfectly evident to them, right? Just as an object in the environment, they can see it. But they clearly won't experience it in the same way that I will, because they've never seen such a thing. They didn't even know about this technology. It could not even, enter into their minds that I could video chat with you who are in Texas, and we can be talking to each other simultaneously at a distance of, maybe 1,000 miles or more. So although they would see the same things as me, they clearly wouldn't experience them in the same way because I'm familiar with these things and they are not. There's therefore a distinction in thought life. And our thought life also colors the things that we experience and makes a certain contribution to our experience. Things are, for example, very, Mike, you played in football, for example. Things would be very scary to me, which are not scary to you at all because you're used to them, right? Being on the bottom of a pile where like somebody fumbled the ball and then you jump and everybody's trying to get, that for me would be a terrifying experience, but it isn't to you because you're used to it, right? So even though it's one and the same thing, we don't experience it in the same way because we have a difference in thought life. We have a difference in, the way we think, the way we interpret the world and so on. We can give further examples. Suppose somebody says something in conversation, right? And it sounds perfectly innocent. But then somebody else who has kind of an anxious and sort of problems of self-confidence or whatever, they take it as a slight dig. They take it as a really subtle insult or something like that. Now you saw no insulting intention in these words whatsoever, whereas this person saw something, subtly insulting or insinuatory or whatever. They see what they see because of their thought life, because they have certain inclinations and tendencies and habits of interpreting the world, which are different from yours. And that those things also make a contribution to what they see. Just like, for example, and I'll give one more example just to illustrate the point. My wife, Rachel, means one thing to me that she does not mean to the children at the school where she works, right? To the children, she's Miss Rachel, and they experience her one way. To me, she's Rachel, my wife, and I experience her in a different way. She means something else to me that she doesn't mean to those children, and that's because our thought life is not the same. I have a certain relationship to her, given my personality, given choices that I've made in my life, given things that I believe about her, and so on. And all these things influence the way that I experience Rachel, and they're not present in those children, so they don't experience her in the same way. Just like, for example, Rachel will not mean the same thing to our children, if God willing we have children, that she does to me, right? To me, she is my wife. To them, she's going to be their mother. So she will not and could not mean the same thing to them that she does to me. So when we think about all this, we think about like what actually appears to us. There's the external objects. all of them appearing at the same time, and all of them, contributing something to our appearance and influencing the way each other appears. There's my own, what I call the lived body. There's my body that I'm aware of as my own, and through which I am in contact with my external environment, and which also contributes to the appearance of things in the way that, for example, my eyes are to explain, are the reason why distant objects look blurry to me. Then there's also my thought life. There's what's going on in my mind, the way that I interpret the world, the way that I think about things, my own personality, my own experiences and memories and so on, and expectations. These things also contribute something to what appears. And then finally, at the very furthest reach of experience, there is simply me as a living, ego, as a living thing that is aware of myself as alive. I am aware of myself as alive, and I can become aware of myself as that's to whom everything appears, right? So I am the to whom, I'm the dative, so to speak, of my experience, and everything else is appearing to me. So phenomenologically speaking, what appears? What is the answer to this question? What appears? Well, everything appears, right? The whole appears, and all at once, myself included. Everything appears to me all at once, external objects, but I also am a part of this whole. So I also become I also am something that appears to myself, although I don't normally notice this, right? My eyes are the reason why things look blurry to me. My thought life is the reason why a certain, sentence was offensive to me rather than not being offensive, or why Rachel means something to me that she doesn't mean to a stranger or whatever. So everything appears, ourselves included, and all at once. That's, according to me, sort of the phenomenological answer to the question, what appears? And then once you can sort of look at things from this point of view, once you can see the whole, the external object, my lived body, my thought life, all of these things as what's appearing to me at any moment in time, and if you can sort of look at the whole conscious experience rather than focusing merely as we normally do on external objects, then you are in the phenomenological attitude. Then you can begin to do phenomenology and to describe things as they show themselves. So that means, for example, if we were to ask the question, what shows itself? What appears? All right. In ordinary discourse, we will say, well, I see a table. Okay. What shows itself is a table. But strictly speaking, if we want to be strict and rigorously phenomenological, we would have to say that what appears is a table to me in the conditions in which I find myself at this time. Right. And these conditions include my bodily conditions, the external environmental conditions, and also my mental conditions. The fact that I'm focusing on a table, the fact that I know how to recognize a table, the fact that I have the notion of a table and can apply that notion to what shows itself in front of me, and so on. So that's how we're able to make evidence judgments. That's how we're able to describe things as they are, by attaining to the phenomenological attitude and seeing everything that shows itself in experience, and understanding that each thing, each individual thing shows itself only as a part of the whole. No thing shows itself entirely. Every individual thing, like the table or the couch or whatever, shows itself only as a part of this greater whole that is constantly showing itself to me so long as I'm conscious and undergoing experience. And this whole includes me. It includes my lived body. It includes my thought life, which colors the way that I experience things, and so on.
Stephen, this is so fascinating. I have so many questions. I guess one thing I'd be interested, or I'm really interested in, is sort of, I know you've written a lot on Thomism, philosophy of religion, and so how does this inform sort of your thoughts as it relates to God, religion, things like that, and sort of what's the value maybe for some of us philosophers or aspiring philosophers to philosophers of religion to study phenomenology? What value does phenomenology add to philosophy of religion? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think phenomenology, well, I would love to talk about this because I have this idea that I have been, publicizing and putting out on the internet, but I haven't yet written a paper on it. So I'm still thinking about, how to write a paper on it. I think that this phenomenological, sort of brief entry into phenomenology that I've talked about can help us when we think about the problem of evil, and specifically when we think about gratuitous evil. Okay, so the big problem in the evidential argument from evil is that various evils appear to be gratuitous. There appears to be nothing that justifies why they happen. Well, so we have to, if we're going to be phenomenologists, we have to take this sentence, right? Some evils appear to be gratuitous, and then we have to, sort of rethink it in light of the insights that we've gained by attaining to the phenomenological attitude. So, for example, the first thing that I would say as a phenomenologist is that nothing simply appears directly, right? Anything only appears as a part of this greater whole, right? So when I say, for example, that an evil appears gratuitous, what I strictly should say is that an evil appears gratuitous to me in the conditions in which I find myself at this moment, right? And these conditions include my own personality, my own thought life, the positioning of my body, and so on. I think that there are two ways in which we make contributions to the appearance of things. One way is through our body and the positioning of our body, and one way is through our thought life. And I think that there's something relevant for the problem of evil in recognizing this double contribution that we make. We can just consider this in a trivial example. Suppose, for example, that Mike, you and I go to the gym and we're going to do some deadlifts, okay?
I love this example already. I love it.
Yeah.
Notice he leaves me out of this example properly.
So suppose you and I go to the gym, Mike, and we're going to do some deadlifts, okay? And you put on, let's say, 5 plates. Maybe you can deadlift more than that, but let's say you put on 5 plates on the bar. That's
a good
what?
Start.
That's 495, okay?
Good warm up. Yeah.
A good start. A good warm up, right? So you do the 495, no problem, right? And I try it, and the most I've ever deadlifted is like 305. So I can't do that. And I try to do the 495, and I say, oh, this is impossible. Okay, now strictly speaking, it's true that the weight seems unliftable to me. But if we want to be accurate, and if we want to be phenomenologically correct, we should say that the weight is unliftable to me because my body is sort of showing its own weakness, right? My body is not up to the task. So it's not that the weight is unliftable in general. It's that it's unliftable to me given the weakness of my body. So also, right, I look at my door. The lock on the door looks blurry, okay? I should not say that the lock is blurry. That's not why it looks blurry to me. Even though if I'm just, thinking about it without thinking too carefully, I would say that the lock looks blurry. The lock looks blurry because my eyes are not good, right? So the blurriness is really a result of my eyes and not a result of the lock. It's not the way that the lock appears on its own. It's the way that the lock appears to me given my eyesight. In the same way, if we want to say that an evil is gratuitous, that means that nothing justifies it. That's what it is for an evil to be gratuitous. Nothing justifies it. But if nothing justifies this evil, that means that nothing that comes before it, nor anything that comes after it, sort of justifies its presence in history. But how can we attain to the position of seeing that nothing that comes before it or after it in history justifies its presence? How can I actually see that there is nothing in all of history that justifies this thing happening? Obviously, I cannot, because I am in history myself. My historical perspective is limited. I cannot get outside of history somehow in order to look at the whole. I can only see things, from a very limited perspective. I'm not even aware of how limited my perspective is, because it could be that there are things happening in my life that will later prove to be extremely significant, even though to me they seem like nothing. So
really this adds like to the skeptical theist, right? It's like more ammunition, or it's a particular way, and the skeptical theist can argue for his thesis. Is that, am I understanding?
Yes, correctly. Right. So the phenomenological skeptical theist will say, listen, to say that an evil is gratuitous is to say that nothing justifies it, and of course, if nothing justifies it, that means that nothing that comes before it nor anything that comes after it. Okay. But how am I going to see that, right? Because the phenomenologist says experience is the final arbiter. How am I going to see that nothing justifies it? Well, I would have to be able to assume some sort of transhistorical perspective, from which I can see that everything that is connected to this evil, from before it in history and everything that's connected to it after in history, there is nothing in all of that that justifies its presence. But obviously I cannot do that. I cannot assume this transhistorical position because I am in history and I have to be. My life goes forward whether I want it to or not. So I cannot assume the necessary position to see that some evil is gratuitous or not. It's true that as I'm experiencing it, I don't see what it's for. Right? I don't know why this thing is happening as it's happening, but that's not the same as seeing that it's gratuitous, because seeing that it's gratuitous is seeing that there is nothing that justifies it. But I don't see that. I just don't see anything that does justify it. That's not the same as saying that nothing justifies it.
It goes beyond our phenomenological um,
Reach.
or the
Yeah.
limits of what we can apprehend and so forth. And so,
Correct. Right.
yeah,
The gratuity of an evil. Right. The gratuity of an evil is not just like I can't figure out anything that justifies it. There is literally nothing that justifies it. But in order for me to make that claim and to make it in a phenomenologically justified way, I would have to be able to assume the position necessary to see that. And I cannot do that as another being in history, right? I have to go forward in history. This is the line from Kierkegaard, right? Our lives can only be understood looking backwards, but they have to be lived going forward. I can't make sense of the things that happen to me as they're happening. I can only understand that after they've happened and some time has passed. But I cannot just stay, thinking about the past. I have to go forward. So we're in this interesting position in our lives where basically like our lives do mean something and the things that happen to us do mean something, but we're stuck unable to know it until, much later. So that's an interesting question. So that's the bodily contribution that we make to the appearance of evil to us, right? We can't assume the necessary position to see that they're gratuitous, but at the same time, we're stuck sort of not seeing why they're happening, right? That doesn't mean that they are gratuitous. This is simply a limitation on appearance that is imposed on our body, that is imposed by our body, by the fact that we live in time and we go forward in time. But there's another thing. I said that we make two contributions to experience, through our body and through our thought life. Okay, and I'm going to include our moral character in this issue of thought life. The problem of evil is not saying, or at least if it is saying this, then it is uninteresting. It's not saying that things occur in the world which we would have prevented. Okay, that's uninteresting. That's an obvious argument. The problem of evil says that things occur in the world which God, if he were to exist and were perfectly good, would have prevented. So let's assume for the moment, that we can assume this sort of transhistorical position relative to all of time, and we can see, all the connections that some evil event bears to everything else in history. That's not enough to know that the evil is gratuitous, because we do not simply have to see that evil from our moral perspective, from the way that we are, right, from our own thought life. We would have to see that evil from God's perspective, and to be able to see that God would judge that evil to be unjustified. But then the question arises, how am I supposed to know what God thinks like? How am I supposed to know how God sees the world?
Right.
Okay, I don't even know how I think half of the time, right? My own thoughts on issues are often confused and uncertain. I don't know whether something is right or wrong. I find myself this confused mess a lot of times. How am I supposed to know what God, the moral ideal agent, thinks about the things that happen in the world? Because the argument from evil, again, says that if God were to exist, he would have prevented this from happening. That assumes that I can know what God thinks like. But how am I supposed to know what God thinks like?
Right.
Right? Who in the history of the world has ever, reasonably, dared to assume that he knows how God thinks? Maybe we do this all the time. Maybe Jesus does. Yeah, Jesus, of course. But he was resurrected. He was God, so he could do it. Of course, God knows what he thinks like. It seems to me absurd to say that this evil is gratuitous, and if God existed, he would have prevented it. No, what you're really saying is that this evil is such that I would have prevented it had I had the opportunity.
Right.
Okay, because it's your thought life is contributing to the appearance of this evil. How do you know that God, with his own thought life, let's say, looks at that evil and sees all the connections that it bears to everything else in history and says, yes, this is horrible, but it has to happen? How do you know that God doesn't say that? Maybe it would be disappointing to us. Maybe it would be sort of unhappy. I mean, why does this have, especially when it has to do with evil things that happen to us? We think like, why did this have to happen to me? Even if God were to give you exactly the answer, probably that wouldn't make you very happy, because you're not so concerned with why this has to happen. You're more concerned with simply it not happening to you, right? You're suffering and you want it to stop. But that doesn't mean that there is not a reason and that God is not justified in allowing it to happen, even though you might want it to stop. So this is, I think, an important contribution that phenomenology, and specifically this phenomenological, interpretation of appearances as, sort of this mixture of different factors all, commingling at the same time. This is a way in which phenomenology, I think, can help contemporary analytic philosophy of religion by really, undermining the strength of, this argument from the apparent gratuity of evil. People say this evil is apparently gratuitous, therefore probably is gratuitous. The phenomenologist says, hold on a second, okay? Because what appears is not simply one object, right? What appears is everything, yourself included, and all at once. And I can identify two specific contributions that you make to the appearance, which account for why you think it's gratuitous, but in fact undermine the inference, right? On the one hand, you are yourself an item in history, and you can only see things from an extremely limited historical perspective. So you cannot see that this evil does not bear some connection to something else in history which justifies it. You can't see that, right? Because you are also in history. You cannot step outside of history and to see its connection with everything. But in the second place, even if you were to be able to do that, you are looking at the evil with your own moral character. You are looking at the evil from your point of view, given the way you are, right? Given your thought life. But the argument says that God would have prevented this evil, not that you would have prevented it. How do you know what God thinks like? And how do you know how God sees the evil? How could you possibly know? The only way you could make a claim to know that is if you assume, by means of an obvious, to my mind, an obvious bias, that you are sufficiently close to the ideal of moral perfection, or you have a sufficiently close grasp of the ideal of moral perfection to know that God would have prevented this. But that, to my mind, is absurd. How am I supposed to know how close I am to the ideal of anything? Right? Mike, how close were you, or how close, let's say, is Russell Wilson to the ideal quarterback?
Pretty close.
That's what you might say, and I might say that too if I weren't thinking carefully. But how do I know what the ideal quarterback is actually like?
Right.
I know that Russell Wilson is good, but perhaps an ideal quarterback would do things radically differently. And then when he does them, I see, oh, wait, that's the right way to do it.
Yeah, right.
Right? And what Russell Wilson was doing was, it was nice, it was good for the time, but this is really the way to go forward.
Right.
We're talking about ideals, right? And we can never, without bias, assume that we have a sufficiently close grasp of the ideal to be able to make such a judgment as, the ideal quarterback would do this, the ideal moral agent would prevent this evil. These are ways in which I think phenomenology, and specifically the phenomenological interpretation of what appears, as everything and all at once, ourselves included, can help philosophy of religion, specifically with respect to the question of evil and gratuitous evil.
Well, that was very helpful to sort of illuminating to figure out exactly how practically phenomenology works, and maybe some analytics might want to utilize, even if they don't buy fully into the system, maybe utilize certain parts of it for their own projects and so forth. And you showed clearly how the thesis of skeptical theism, right, might be more robustly defended utilizing certain resources of phenomenology. So it's kind of like, in summary, phenomenology understands that consciousness is fundamental and it's the final arbiter. We analyze what is through our conscious experience, and we determine what we know through our conscious experience. And once we truly analyze, systematically sort of dissect our conscious experience and the limits it has, and so on and so forth, we can sort of apply it to certain problems in philosophy where we might get certain new insights or does this seem
I think that's exactly on point. I agree with
the closest I've come now to understanding phenomenology, so I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, Stephen, this has been great, man. Thank you so much for your time and for all your wisdom, and we really appreciate your work, and we're going to have you back on to lay it out some more. You've gotten Tyler a step closer, which is evidence of a miracle. So well done, brother. But thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you both very much for having me. It was a lot of fun.